Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at VCU, welcome to the July presentation of the Wilder School Lunch and Learn series. Today, we have a special presentation, FAFSA Complications and Implications, with Jill Desjean, Director of Policy Analysis for the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, and Dr. Hernan Bucheli, Vice President for Strategic Enrollment Management and Student Success for VCU. For those of you joining for the first time, welcome. The Wilder School offers a unique opportunity like this one for learning and growth on monthly free virtual events. Each session features change agents, thought leaders, and policymakers who provide insights and commentary on the relevant topics of the day, none more relevant than what we discussed today. My name is Stephen Dozier, and I am the Wilder School's Senior Director of Development. Before we get started, I have one very brief announcement. Yesterday, we released the new findings from our Wilder School Commonwealth poll, which have been picked up by several news outlets, as you can see on this slide. Our timely findings highlight the 2024 election. So please see the chat for more links to this poll. And before we get started, I now pass the mic over to our esteemed Dean of the Wilder School, Dr. Susan Gooden. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Welcome, everyone. Very excited about today's session, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. As Stephen mentioned, we're very excited about our Commonwealth poll. We know that the election season is upon us, and just want to also share with you an upcoming event that will be happening at the Wilder School on September the 17th, which is our Wilder Symposium. This is an annual event that is hosted by the namesake of our school, Governor Wilder. And this will be on campus Tuesday, September 17th, Elections 2024, the importance of listening to the people, 5 to 7 p.m. So please mark your calendars and plan to join us then as we continue to follow this unprecedented election season. And then as we segue into our topic for today, relative to the FAFSA, I also wanted to share that our Research Institute for Social Equity released yesterday a report on equity challenges and opportunities in the revised FAFSA. And so you can look at this brief and this report. One of the things that this report highlights is that the implications for financial aid and for FAFSA disproportionately impacts minority students, low-income students, and women who are more likely to apply for financial aid. So I thought that was a perfect segue as we take up the topic today to realize that these implications do affect minorities, low-income students, and women in particular. So with that, I'm excited to introduce our moderator for today, who is Hernan Bucheli. He is our Vice President for Strategic Enrollment and Enrollment Management and Student Success here at VCU. I've had the pleasure of working with Dr. Bucheli on a number of student success and enrollment issues. He's developed a wonderful data dashboard that we all come to rely upon on a daily basis to track our enrollments. He brings over 25 years of experience in the student success space and has a wonderful track record in his own regard in terms of outcomes and impacts. So very excited, Dr. Bucheli, for you to be joining us today, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Gooden, and welcome all. Good afternoon. A heartfelt welcome to Jill Desjean in particular. We appreciate you finding the time to meet with us today. We at Virginia Commonwealth University appreciate the timely updates you have provided to higher education during this highly unusual FAFSA rollout. Your advocacy is valued as we work together with the Department of Education to improve financial aid delivery to all students. With that, in way of introduction, Jill is the Director of Policy Analysis at the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators organization. In her role, Jill manages the policy analysis team, interprets federal student aid legislation and regulations from NAFSA's members, and works with NAFSA's members to develop policy recommendations and provides feedback to policymakers on legislative and regulatory proposals. Big important responsibilities there. Prior to joining NASFA in 2016, Jill enjoyed a 20-year career in financial aid administration, having held roles in financial aid offices at Tufts University School of Medicine, MIT, Brandeis, and the College of Holy Cross in Massachusetts, as well as the New York School in New York City. With that, I would like to now introduce Jill Desjean to present.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. Thank you for advancing that slide. As was mentioned, I'm Jill Desjean. I am the Director of Policy Analysis at NASFA. And you're all here because you know that college opens doors to opportunities, but the price tag can put a college education out of reach for many Americans. And the organization I represent, NASFA, supports the financial aid administrators who work on college campuses to make college affordable and college dreams possible. And we do that by providing financial aid administrators with training and regulatory assistance, policy analysis, which is the team that I lead up, and advocacy for equitable financial aid policies for all students. And my organization, NASFA, represents roughly 29,000 financial aid administrators at 3,000 post-secondary education institutions who serve 9 out of every 10 undergraduate students in the US. Could we advance to the next slide, please? Thank you so much. So today I'm going to try to answer the big questions, the what, the why, the when, the who, and the how of FAFSA simplification. I'll also discuss how all of the changes coming out of the FAFSA simplification effort have impacted schools and students and will continue to impact them into the longer term beyond just this year. And I'll be defining some jargon later on before I start mentioning acronyms and things that you've likely never heard of, but I just realized later on, I'm not defining what the FAFSA is. So for those of you who are here and have no idea even what I'm talking about right now, the FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid. And it's the entry point to post-secondary federal student financial aid. So if you've heard of things like federal Pell Grants or federal work study or federal direct loans, the way you apply for those is by using this federal form called the FAFSA. It's also the gateway to institutional financial aid, state financial aid, and some private aid as well. So it's really one of those first steps that students take when they're really starting the process of applying to college. They, once they've narrowed down their options, they're filling out an application for admission, and they're probably filling out their FAFSA around the same time. So wanted to make sure before I start saying FAFSA, 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 that I actually told you what it is. So can we go? Thank you. We're on the next slide already. I know you're all coming from different levels of familiarity with all of this, so I'll try to be sure to cover the basics, but also dig a little deeper so everyone can get something out of this next 20-25 minutes or so. So starting with the what is FAFSA simplification? What is this effort that we're talking about today? Where we are right now is actually the product of 3 separate pieces of legislation that have been passed by Congress since 2019. So the first one was called the Future Act, and it actually doesn't seem like when you first talk about it, it has anything to do with financial aid because it's about the Internal Revenue Code. It amends the IRC, or the Internal Revenue Code, to allow expanded sharing of taxpayer data. As you can imagine, your taxpayer data is very, very protected for good reason. The IRS can't just share that with other government agencies without permission. And so the Future Act permitted the IRS to share federal taxpayer information with the Department of Education for purposes of applying for financial aid, as well as for applying for income-based student loan repayment. The next law is the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, which streamlined and simplified the FAFSA by leveraging the Future Act that I just mentioned to incorporate that new data sharing authority between IRS and the Department of Education. That might not sound very exciting, but the Future Act basically enabled Congress to significantly shorten the FAFSA by removing all the income questions. That information can come from the IRS, so families don't have to answer, what is your adjusted gross income? How much did you pay in tax last year? How much did you withdraw from your IRA? Because the Department of Education would have a new source of that data. They could just rely on the IRS. The government's already got that data. Now these 2 agencies can talk to each other and share it. And so not only were there a lot of income questions on the FAFSA, but those income questions were the hardest ones to answer. Families had to go and look back at their tax return, find line 32 and subtract line 31. It uses, jargon from a tax return, like adjusted gross income and deductions, and just language that people aren't just throwing around every day. And so they were not just a lot of questions, they were the bulk of the questions on the FAFSA, but they were the hardest ones to answer. And so by being able to remove those questions, the FAFSA became both shorter and easier to complete. The law also changed a lot of things outside of the FAFSA itself. It was an appropriations bill, so it also funded the government. But in terms of student financial aid, simplified the FAFSA, but then also made some significant changes to student eligibility, including expanding federal Pell Grant eligibility to students who are enrolled in prison education programs, and allowing students who have prior convictions for drug offenses or who didn't register with the selective service system. Those students all were historically not allowed to benefit from federal student aid, and changes were made in that same law that simplified the FAFSA that allows those students to access the federal student aid programs now. It also changed the way Pell Grant eligibility is determined to make that simpler, and sort of overall just made the eligibility formula for all types of federal student aid a little more generous through some tweaks here and there in the formula, made it such that most people who are applying for financial aid will demonstrate more financial need starting in 24-25 than they would have in the past, simply by nature of tweaks to the formula. And so lastly, the third law that resulted in this big FAFSA Simplification Act was the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2022, yet another appropriations bill that funded the government, but also had a lot of other good stuff in it, one of which was related to FAFSA simplification. And most of what that did, some technical amendments, and it shifted the implementation date of this effort, simplifying the FAFSA, making these formula changes from the 23-24 award year to 24-25. And that was because the Department of Education went back to Congress and said, this is a complete and total overhaul of the student aid application process, and the formula that lies behind it. The amount of time that they had just wasn't enough. It wasn't a long enough runway to be able to make such big changes by 23-24. So they asked Congress for another year, and they got it. More on that later, because the extra year turns out to not have been enough. But that was really what this third law that made FAFSA simplification happen did. So I mentioned jargon, so I just wanted to throw a couple terms out there I might use here that I'm using many times every day, but you likely are not. A Pell Grant, I mentioned that this is the primary federal student grant program for post-secondary education, and it's intended for lower income students. And the maximum award for the upcoming 24-25 academic year is $7,395. Another term I might throw around a little bit is either the EFC or the SAI. These are acronyms. These are names given to the results of the federal formula that's applied to the data that a family reports on their FAFSA. So the FAFSA pulls in net income information from the IRS. The family says, how many family members they have living in their house. They give a little bit of information about their assets, demographic data. Formulas applied to it, and the end result used to be the EFC, or what was called the expected family contribution, and moving forward, starting again in 24-25 and beyond, is now called the Student Aid Index, or the SAI. And it's it basically is a number that determines what kind of financial aid you're eligible for. It's not meant to represent what you're expected to pay. It's really an eligibility index. And the lower your SAI is, the more eligibility you have for financial aid. The higher your SAI is, the less financial aid you're eligible to receive. And so in terms of implications of all these changes, certainly, of course, every school has its own unique demographics. So I'm talking about national data, which may not apply to every single school, but national data show that with these changes to the eligibility formula, more students will qualify for Pell Grants, more students will qualify for the maximum $7,395 reward, and overall eligibility for all types of aid is increased because student aid indexes are trending lower than what EFCs were in the past due to those more generous changes that were made to the formula. So now that full implementation has taken place, we're expecting to see just sort of greater eligibility need for financial aid, and hopefully correspondingly extra financial aid to fill that need for students. A couple of notable things from all of these changes have found their way into the news. I think the most popular one, and I think this is mentioned in the sort of the marketing materials for this event, was about a Brookings paper that I did with Phil Levine from Wellesley College, having to do with how many family members are enrolled in college at the same time, and the impact of that on a student's eligibility for financial aid. So a really major change got made this year, where essentially in the past, this is a very simplified way of putting it, but you almost get a 2-for-1 discount if you had 2 children enrolled in college at the same time. Whereas if you had 2 children 4 years apart, you would pay, you know, a certain amount for one child and the same amount for the other child. And what was taken away through this FAFSA simplification effort was this favorable treatment for families who have more than one child in college at the same time. And it's a weedy topic for sure. It certainly does negatively impact families who, if you're currently enrolled in college, you were in school last year, you got the benefit of that treatment last year, and then this year you won't, it will decrease your eligibility for financial aid. It is a small portion of the total number of people who apply for financial aid, but that is of course of little solace to the people who are actually impacted by this change. And I'll talk about this a little bit more moving on. But the good news with this is that schools have some flexibility here. Schools certainly, don't want to see a student going from sophomore year to junior year and seeing a huge cut in their financial aid and not being able to continue attending just because the formula changed. It's not as though the family's ability to pay has changed at all. And so schools, were able to do some modeling. Many schools decided to sort of legacy in old policies such that they could make up for any lost federal aid with institutional dollars, so that the net impact on the student was minimal, so that they could finish their studies. And then with the new students coming in, they'll apply the new policy. Another change that you probably saw was the change to treatment of families who either own a small business, so a business with less than 100 employees, or families that have a family farm. And basically, under the old methodology, those families didn't report the value of the asset, any assets that were held by the business or the family farm. Those were just ignored in the eligibility formula entirely. And with FAFSA simplification, those assets needed to be considered in the formula. And so this is the impacts of this one, we actually have to wait for data from the current academic year to be able to see who's impacted, because we never asked the question, do you own a small business? Do you own a family farm? So we don't know how many people are out there who have these assets. We don't know what the values of these assets are. So we'll really have to look at this first year's data from 24-25 and see how many people were impacted and how large the impacts were to really be able to assess, was this, did this work as intended? Is this unfairly penalizing people, or is this the way it always should have been? So more to come on that. But again, it's one of those things where schools may have made choices internally to sort of, provide like a little bit of a buffer, to lessen the blow and say, let's make up with institutional dollars what a student might have lost in federal aid dollars, so that they're not seeing some sudden change to their eligibility. But moving forward for new students, they would be adopting the new policy, which would count those assets. And of course, all these changes came with an unanticipated impact, and probably the most significant one of all of these, and that was the delayed release of the 24-25 FAFSA. It certainly wasn't part of the plan, but it is what happened. The FAFSA for this upcoming school year that starts, in September for traditional calendar schools, that FAFSA normally would have been out nearly a year before school starts. It usually comes out on October 1st. And so for the 24-25 cycle, instead of October 1, we saw a FAFSA come out at the very end of December. That was the date is notable because the statutory deadline for the FAFSA is January 1. So the department knew they had to get it out in order to comply with the law by January 1. They released something on December 30th, and it was pretty unstable during the first week. It definitely was not yet ready to be released, but they put out there what they had. Students had a lot of challenges just accessing the form. Even if they were able to get in, they were sometimes unable to submit the form or complete it. They would get caught up on pages, just a lot of things that you probably read about or saw on the news with serious challenges. The department was able to address that instability pretty early on, within about a week. But once a significant volume of students was getting into the FAFSA, we started hearing issues with the formula not being calculated correctly, many students just unable to sort of progress through the form. A lot of issues that are continuing truly until this day. Schools didn't get FAFSA data until, pardon me, late March. Paper FAFSAs, students who filled out the form in paper versus online, those still have not been processed by the Department of Education. So any student who filled out a paper form has not been told by their school how much aid they're eligible for. And we're in mid-July, and for many students, they would be looking to start school in a month, 6 weeks, something like that. Schools only have limited ability right now to make corrections to any student's FAFSA data. So it's an ongoing issue for sure. And we certainly saw over the course of the spring, application and deposit deadlines getting shifted. But we also saw many students just missing deadlines and hence missing out on aid altogether. We're still down on FAFSA submissions this year as compared to this time last year. So certainly, we don't know where 24-25 will end up, but having lower FAFSA completion rates from one year to the next is definitely concerning, is sort of reminiscent of the pandemic when we saw big enrollment drops. So a logical question when you hear all that is, why did we make all these changes when they resulted in so much chaos? Obviously, the chaos was not intended. And there was good justification for the changes that were made. And, one of the biggest impetus behind all of this was expanding access to post-secondary education. The FAFSA, the application for financial aid itself, was a barrier to students getting financial aid. It was long, it was complicated. It took a long time to fill out. You needed to have your parents sitting with you. You needed to dig up your tax returns. It was very daunting. And so for families who maybe had a family member already go through college, it was an inconvenience. It was a hassle. But for families who were, first generation students, families who are new to this country, students whose parents maybe don't have English as a first language, anyone who might be a little bit behind in their ability to be able to apply for college, the FAFSA presented a greater barrier. So we know that low income and first generation students were 2 to 3 times more likely to report finding the FAFSA difficult to complete. And the Department of Education's National Center for Education Statistics has published data showing, pardon me, NCS has published data showing a larger percentage of students in the lowest socioeconomic status quintile did not complete the FAFSA in the past compared to students in higher SES categories. And 34% of Hispanic students and 27% of Black students did not complete a FAFSA because they or their family didn't have enough information about how to complete it, compared to only about 18% of white students. So we clearly had an access problem. The people who needed financial aid the most, those with lower incomes and who had been traditionally underrepresented in post-secondary education, were the ones who were finding the aid application process too daunting. And without aid, they presumably either couldn't attend college or were potentially undermatching, going to a cheaper college, but maybe not the right schools for them. Another big impetus behind these efforts was increasing Pell Grant predictability and transparency. So still very much related to expanding access, but more about messaging. Basically, if it's easy to find out, say in the 5th grade, that your family might qualify for a Pell Grant, that could really change your entire educational trajectory. It might bring conversations about going to college to the dinner table. It might cause your parents to get a little bit more involved with the courses that you're taking and say, making sure that math class is the right one to take to get you into college. It might start some college savings behavior, just sort of creating a college going mentality. And so the idea is just getting that message out sooner. And that wasn't possible under the old system. You had to essentially fill out the long FAFSA, all of your income information, all your demographic information, all of your asset information, calculate an EFC, and then look up what amount of Pell Grant that corresponded to. That's not something that people would do. The idea behind this is that we could have this very simple lookup table. What's your adjusted gross income? How big is your family? that tells you whether you'd get a Pell Grant or not and how much you would receive. So families could find that out pretty quickly. That could be something that guidance offices were doing in middle school or in high school to try to just sort of, again, like encourage that college going mentality and mindset. The other win here was program integrity and data accuracy. With income data coming directly from the IRS, we essentially know that it's accurate. And this protects taxpayers from fraud and abuse in the Title IV aid programs. And it also reduces the need for a process called verification, which was the secondary step that many Pell Grant eligible students, who are the lower income students who might come from populations that it's already harder for them to complete the process, they'd get selected for this thing called verification, where they had to submit a bunch of paperwork to the financial aid office. Very burdensome for students, very burdensome for financial aid offices, and a big barrier to enrollment. It was a place where a lot of students got lost in that college pipeline and just said, this isn't for me. They thought they were in trouble because they were selected for a verification, or they couldn't collect the paperwork, or whatever it might be. And that could have been the stopping point where they didn't enroll in college. And so with this accurate data coming from the IRS, it essentially eliminates the need for verification, and removes this big burden for students and for schools. So, typically when you're trying to simplify a process, you're usually sacrificing some level of accuracy. If you've got this form where you ask 100+ questions, and then you cut the questions down to 30, you lose something. But in this case, this is like the rare event where we actually shortened the form significantly, made it more simple, but we retained or even probably improved upon the accuracy of the data that we were getting. So kind of a win-win there. I won't spend too much time on this timeline because most of it's already happened. We are, so this is just kind of showing you at what point different provisions of the FAFSA Simplification Act became effective. We are technically fully implemented at this point. The FAFSA for 24-25 is out. It doesn't work for everyone. I mentioned we still have a lot of challenges, even at this point where we're bumping up against the start of the school year. So it's not perfect. I would say it's fully implemented, but not fully perfectly implemented. Moving on to the tentacles of FAFSA simplification reach far past the financial aid office. So whenever we're talking to our members or to other organizations, we're always sure to stress that this is really a campus-wide effort to get this thing implemented, and that it has impacts on most offices on campus. So I won't go into the details here, it's way too much, but you can see here I just listed out many of the campus units that have some either role to play in FAFSA simplification, or their campuses are impacted in some way by these changes, or their offices, I should say, are impacted by these changes. Pardon me. So here I'm just trying to show how different constituencies are impacted by this FAFSA simplification effort. A message that hasn't been getting across that is really important, because I do spend a lot of my time complaining about the rocky rollout of the FAFSA this year, but the message that hasn't been getting across is that actually the form is significantly better. All of those changes that Congress intended, with this data coming directly from the IRS, when that works, it is beautiful. When people who filled out a FAFSA last year fill it out this year and it works, they say that was a breeze. I can't believe how easy it was. I can't believe how little time it took me. So that's the messaging that we really need to work on. We've justifiably been concerned about the rollout this year and its impacts on students, but we don't want to complain so much that students are still in that mindset of, it's too hard to apply for financial aid. Why even bother? Unfortunately, this was a year that was supposed to be sort of a victory for college access. Like, hey, there's a new FAFSA. It's great. Go fill it out. Because of this rocky implementation, people just kind of saw more of the same. And I think that narrative is going to linger for longer. And so I think probably everyone here has some part, certainly my organization has some part, and college access professionals have a part to really start pushing that other narrative, which is, it is better. It didn't go too well this year, but it is a better form, and please go fill it out. There is bad news as well. As I mentioned, this rocky rollout has meant that many students have missed deadlines or just given up on the financial aid process. So we're hopeful that maybe they haven't given up forever, but that remains to be seen. We'll look at enrollment numbers from this year and see where things play out. If there are lower enrollments for this year, For schools that are already struggling, that could mean even a closure. And of course, that has implications for currently enrolled students who, may not be able to easily transfer. And also even for communities, colleges and universities employ a lot of people. When a college closes, it impacts the community that surrounds it as well. So again, I've said it a couple of times, but the implications of this rocky FAFSA rollout really do have a pretty broad effect and will probably linger for a couple of years. There are political ramifications, of course. We were talking at the beginning, Dean Gooden was saying that we have an election coming up. This rocky rollout doesn't paint the current administration in a great light, and that could have implications for this November's election, and of course budget implications for all of this. Both for the federal government, states, and institutions. So in terms of what we're looking for moving ahead, we're asking, what is 25-26 going to look like? This new, next year's FAFSA is supposed to be out in October, in a couple of months. Our understanding is that, the department has been spending so much time on 24-25 and just trying to get those last things ironed out, those last bugs ironed out, that they haven't had as much time to be able to devote to 25-26. So their plan is to not make a lot of changes for next year because they simply don't have the resources. We just want a smooth rollout. We want to see not just a FAFSA that works, we want to see the whole process work. So I talked about how schools waited a long time to get the actual data. We want it the way it used to be. Fill out your FAFSA, the school gets the information in 1 to 3 days, because yes, being able to fill out the FAFSA in October is a great thing, but if your school doesn't have the data until March, it hasn't done a lot for a student. The student doesn't know how much it's going to cost them to college. They don't have time to compare aid offers. They don't have time to make plans for how they're going to pay. It isn't really a win for students to just have a FAFSA by October 1st. We need a fully functioning system. If it can't be October 1st, we can wait a little bit. That's okay. We need the fully functioning system. And we understand at this point, it might not be October 1st. We're looking at technical corrections already. We've seen some of the fallout of 24-25, little things like wording of questions or things where Congress removed a question from the FAFSA that we think still belongs there. And so, I mentioned the number in college thing, I mentioned the family farm and small business thing. Those might be areas, once we see data, that we say, this doesn't seem like it was great policy. We think you need to go back to the old way, but we need data to be able to, to assess that for sure. I think that's kind of it for the future. I just wanted to, this is my last slide. I just wanted to share, without the benefit of actual data, we have projections. And so this is a projection courtesy of the Urban Institute, and they're estimating how all of the formula changes in the FAFSA Simplification Act might play out in terms of Pell Grant only eligibility. So not eligibility for all types of aid, but who qualifies for a Pell Grant. And the big takeaways here are, when you look at the gray, those are the people whose Pell Grant awards stay most of the same, somewhere within $500 plus or minus what their current award is. So not a significant impact to their eligibility. What you see in the blue little segments here are people who, I hate to say winners and losers, but these are the winners. These are the people who get more Pell Grant, more than $500 of an increase to their Pell Grant. And that is mostly among students who are sort of moderate income, mostly like moderate income students. And then we do see some losses in Pell Grant eligibility among moderate to higher income families, and those are the people in pink. And that's that number in college thing. When you split someone's family contribution in half, for people who were sort of on the cusp, it threw them into Pell Grant eligibility. But once you stop doing that, it takes them out. And so the Department of Ed has estimated that's about 4% of total applicants. So, overall, nationally speaking, everyone, the trend is positive, but it's not for every single student. Some students are negatively impacted by these changes. And I think that's all I have. I see some things in the chat. I'm sorry, I just couldn't follow it while I was reading. So feel free to ask those as questions, and I'm happy to elaborate anywhere it wasn't clear or answer any new questions as well.
Well, Jill, thank you. Great job. We do have some questions from the audience. So we'll start off with the first question. And you've already kind of answered it pretty thoroughly, actually. But I'll throw a little bit of a curveball to it. So the question is, what is the earliest date a family can fill out a FAFSA? We know that we're hoping for October. But the real end game here is to make sure that the institutions have all the information they need so families can make decisions on time. And so that's what you're really working towards, probably more towards than just a October 1 date. But in regard to that question, what are you seeing right now in terms of issues that may cause that to be delayed? Is there anything that's brewing that you're seeing? It may not be in October, even for the folks filling out a FAFSA. Are you seeing something in the summer that isn't working out technically with FAFSA? That that's one question. And the other piece is, the CEO of College Board is going to now be involved in this. And what's your take on the implications of that? I'm just curious.
Yeah, so I guess starting first with sort of what's the holdup? Why wouldn't the FAFSA be ready October 1? I think plain and simple, the resources that would go toward getting 25-26 up and running for October 1 are still devoted to fixing 24-25. There are enough unsolved issues from this year. Those deadlines are looming, right? We've got students who are trying to start school in the fall. We have students who are in school in the summer who, may not get a financial aid award, may have to delay their enrollment until later. So, there are only so many people who have the expertise to work on the FAFSA. I think they're working on 24-25, and that's really what's going to delay 25-26. In terms of Jeremy Singer taking over from the College Board in this interim position where he's kind of overseeing the FAFSA process for cleanup for 24-25 and getting things started for 25-26. We would have hoped that there were people at the department that had the expertise that could have gotten this cleaned up. I think it's a matter of resources. They found someone who clearly has the expertise. The College Board gets the profile out every year. They didn't struggle this year. I think it made good sense to bring someone in who has the expertise. I think we're looking forward to working with him just to make sure that we see this FAFSA cycle be a lot smoother than next year. We just have our fingers crossed that will work.
Thank you, Jill. And you mentioned the CSS profile. What do you think about the CSS profile in terms of risk management for institutions moving forward versus the FAFSA? Any thoughts on that?
In terms of schools maybe adopting the profile that haven't used it? Yeah, it's a real challenge. The whole one of many of the goals of FAFSA simplification was not to simplify, I guess maybe not goals. Something we always warned about, this FAFSA simplification conversation has been happening for more than a decade. And the thing we've always warned about is don't make it so short that schools need information that isn't there, because that will force them to ask for another application. There's nothing wrong with the profile per se, but it is another step that students have to complete. So, if a school has always relied on the FAFSA and has always had enough information from just that form to award their own aid, we don't want them going to the profile and making it harder for students to apply for financial aid because of an effort to make it easier. The profile has a cost associated with it as well. And there are a few waivers for low-income students, but it is just another step. It's just more things for people to do and more places where someone might just say, oh, like that's the thing I can't do. It'll be interesting to see after this year how many schools might go to profile, because it was more reliable this year. The profile schools didn't struggle this year because they had that data, even without having the FAFSA data. So there's no denying that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Also, another question here. Can you touch more on the students that were negatively affected by the new FAFSA and what can be done about it? Personally, the full ride, there's a question. The full ride for 3 years from VCU was cut to 0. Anyway, yeah, if you could just touch on what negatively affected by the new FAFSA, what can be done about it now? Appeals, financial aid appeals, is that what institutions are doing?
Yeah, so some schools are being proactive and are, just sort of filling the gap that was left by any lost federal aid with institutional aid when they can do that. In some cases, it might create what's called an over-award situation where you're actually giving the student more financial aid than the federal government would allow. There are caps on how much financial aid you can get. If you get $1 of federal aid, you have to play by the federal aid rules. And so in those cases, it would be more of an appeal process where a school could use what's called professional judgment and actually account for more than one student in college in the federal aid formula. It's they can't just split it in half like they used to do, but they can do things like take into account how much does the other school cost and sort of reduce a family's income by the cost of the other school. It's more unwieldy, it's more work for the family, it's more work for the financial aid office, but there are workarounds. There's also, of course, the amount of resources, right? A school can acknowledge your need and not necessarily be able to fill it.
And what are you hearing nationwide about appeals this year and how institutions are handling those and the volume of those financial aid appeals?
Yeah, I can't say that I haven't heard a lot either way. I certainly haven't heard that there's been, some deluge of appeals. So I do suspect that in the cases, again, like with the people who are negatively impacted, 4% of everyone who's completing a FAFSA. So, it's not going to be this tremendous increase at any one school. And I think schools also, to my earlier point, have been a little proactive where they can be. So I haven't heard that appeals are through the roof, that everyone's appealing. Nothing like that.
And from an advocacy level, what do you recommend institutions do to help advocate for what you're, not only with FAFSA, but with government officials and state officials to make sure that families are able to get their FAFSA information in, but schools get their information on time? Any advice for institutions?
Yeah, I think, I think, it means a lot more coming from institutions going and talking to the lawmakers that your school, that when you're a constituent of that lawmaker, they're much more interested in hearing the stories from those individual schools. We bring our members in up to the Hill all the time because people want to hear about schools that are in their districts, and if you can share real stories, I think that's a really effective advocacy thing, not just saying we don't like this, but listen to what this thing did. If there's a policy that you don't really like and you've seen how it impacts your students or how it impacts your school, telling those stories really brings it more to light. Bringing data and telling stories are the two things that I think are the most effective advocacy tools for making change.
Okay, great. Another question here. Is there a time frame on when the public can expect the Office of the Inspector General to release their investigative report on the department's fiscal year 25 FAFSA rollout?
I don't know the timeline for that.
Okay. In terms of communicating with students and making sure that they're fully aware of the FAFSA issues, what advice do you provide to institutions even now for the FAFSA next year and for current students that are still trying to get their things in order for this fall?
This year's been so hard for schools to communicate to students because we weren't getting information from the Department of Education. So the thing that we keep stressing is, if you can't make October 1, that's okay. Tell us now. We need to know as soon as possible so that our schools can form a communication strategy. It's very difficult when you find out something is, on the date that something was due, it's not happening and it won't happen for 6 weeks. No one was prepared for that. Then you have to kind of start from the beginning, form your communication strategy, get that out to students after they've seen it in the news and heard from it from all these other places. And, the information has been so, like a game of telephone and you kind of can't bring them back. So, that's one of the big things that NASFA has been working on is just when things are going wrong, just give us a clear time frame. We just need to know as far in advance when something isn't going to meet a deadline so that we can share that with our members and our members can make decisions and communicate with their students effectively. I think the other thing in terms of this year, the message has to be it's not too late. Like if you haven't filled out your FAFSA yet, do it. Just fill it out. It's not that bad. It's, the messaging and people weren't wrong. We were saying it too in the spring was this is a disaster, so understandably families were saying it's a disaster. Let's not touch this. But at this point, most of the wrinkles have been ironed out. Most people are having a smooth experience and it's not too late if you had plans to go to college this year to fill out the FAFSA.
Thank you. Very good advice. Another question here, are you aware of any programs that will be replacing the Fresh Start program, which is going to end on September 30th?
I don't know anything about anything new related to that, no.
Okay. And one of the things that, and you touched upon this on your presentation, but with the changes in the FAFSA, undocumented students have been negatively impacted by some of this because of, a new application and whatnot. But what advice do you have for institutions in terms of working through these issues with undocumented students?
Yeah, the big challenge with the FAFSA, because undocumented students still don't qualify for federal
Right.
student aid, so they still can't fill out the FAFSA. But the issue was with these sort of mixed immigration families where the student was born in the
Right.
US, is a citizen, their parents aren't. And so they frequently don't have social security numbers. That whole process was a disaster. And excuse me, that was really unfortunate because we were talking with, likely if your parents were not born here, English may not be their first language. They may not be college educated. There was this incredibly tedious, long process for them to get this thing called an FSA ID so they could fill out their FAFSA. There was this emailed invitation they got. It was really messy and really complicated. And it is largely resolved, but not entirely. We still do hear about here and there people having to employ these sort of convoluted workarounds to be able to do it. But, again, I think the message is, especially now that things have sort of slowed down a bit, I think that it's easier to call the financial aid office and ask them to help to walk you through it, visit the financial aid office and say, this is the challenge I'm facing. Like, I think every financial aid office at this point knows all the workarounds. We've just been hearing from so many students and just have had to learn for ourselves, and our community is great. Every time someone learns something, they share it with everyone else. And so, FAAs have been a great resource to one another to, say, hey, I've got this wacky situation. And someone says, don't worry, I've seen it already. This is how you do it, So I think we can still catch some of these students from these mixed immigration statuses that struggled so much to fill out their FAFSA early on.
Oh, thank you. What observations would you provide to people in the Zoom meeting regarding what you think financial aid offices across the nation have experienced over the last 10 months related to the FAFSA Simplification Act?
What was the beginning of that?
What observations would you provide?
It's been a hard year. It's been a very, very hard year. Financial aid offices have been understaffed since the pandemic. That's really when our hard times started. We were, trying to just help students get through, in those early months, March 2020, trying to get students through the rest of the year. We had this great influx of, CARES money and the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund, which was great, but we had a lot to learn. Those funds came with conditions and rules, and we had to learn all the rules and then distribute those funds to students. So it was a very, very stressful time. A lot of people ended up leaving the profession. We have not been able to refill those positions. So I was just at our national conference in June. Offices are still very short-staffed. And now they've been through this FAFSA cycle where, again, they've just been, it's not just delays, it's not just mistakes. It's been that many times the problems that have come up have been, oh, now you need to check a manual list to see, which of your students have accurate data. There's been so much manual additional work. So it's not just that we had this compressed time frame. We had a compressed time frame with more actual work that we never had to do before. And so, our community is great. The people that I talked to at our conference have been working really hard and looking forward to vacations, but they're not giving up. But it's rough times. We really need to bring some new people into the profession. We need to fully staff our offices, and everybody needs a vacation for sure.
We like hearing that, vacation. Yeah, financial aid offices, including VCUs, just have stepped up this year, and they're doing yeoman's work for sure. Thank you for that. Another question here. How does the FAFSA Simplification Act address the issue of financial aid transparency and predictability for applicants?
I would say the biggest place where the transparency and predictability come into play is with this new Pell Grant eligibility formula that really just relies on a family's income and the number of people in their household. And this is sort of the place where, if you have followed this for a long time, Senator Alexander, before he retired from Tennessee, he used to unfurl the FAFSA at conferences and different events and say, look at how long this thing is, how can anybody be expected to do this? And he had this idea of a postcard. He said, people should be able to apply for financially in a postcard. What's your adjusted gross income? How many people are in your family? That should determine your eligibility. It didn't get realized for every type of financial aid. We still have the form, we still have, the student aid index, but for Pell Grants, people can find out if they'll qualify for a Pell Grant based on 2 data points. And so that allows for these easy lookup tables. You don't have to enter every little fact about your family to find out whether you'll qualify for a Pell Grant. And so that's really where I think that predictability and transparency come into play, and where that can really lead to just like a mindset, a college going mindset among families who might have that mindset going in, college isn't for my kids. It's too expensive. It's not affordable. We can't do this. Maybe when they hear, oh, we can get an $8,000 Pell Grant. Well, hey, that might make this, state school down the street quite affordable for us. Maybe we should think about this more. So I think that's the biggest place where that comes into play.
Thank you. A couple more questions here. Can you discuss any student family reaction to introducing the term contributor to the FAFSA?
Yeah, we did a little bit of focus group work before the FAFSA came out, but when we knew that they were going to use this term contributor, I think it was a little bit confusing in the sense that we had that term expected family contribution, and it was sort of a constant thorn in our side where people understandably thought, oh, this is how much I'll pay for college, which it's not. It is just sort of a ranking index. And so we got rid of it with the student aid index, but then family members got called contributors. And so I think that does kind of plant the seed of, this is a person who's expected to pay for my education. And that may or may not be the case for different families. So I don't have a suggestion for a change to that, but I think we did hear from some people that contributor was a confusing term.
Okay. And again, you touched upon this in your presentation about more Pell eligible students should benefit, right, from the formula. But the question is, are schools starting to see that? Institutions starting to see that? What have you heard from institutions in terms of more Pell eligible students or higher amounts?
Yeah, I'm not hearing a lot. We haven't done it. We've been very careful about taxing our members. We certainly wouldn't survey our members right now. We'd love to get our hands on some data, but at the same time, it's just not something that we can do right now. And of course, data from the Department of Education is always lagging by a couple of years. So yeah, I can't say right now how that's played out on campuses. Hopefully we'll know in a year or two, definitely once Department of Ed data comes out, but maybe even sooner, if we can get our institutions in a good place where we can actually ask them some questions about what they saw this year.
And then can you discuss any student family reaction to introduce, oh no, we already talked about that. I think that's it. Those are all the questions. Any more questions from the audience? All righty. Well, at this point, thank you so much, Jill, for a very thorough presentation, for walking us through this information on the implications of the FAFSA Simplification Act. We're very grateful for you being a part of our speaker series, and I'd like to thank Dr. Susan Gooden in the Wilder School for the opportunity to discuss this very important topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Hernan. What an excellent discussion we've had today. And I hope those who have been able to attend, have an opportunity to get all their questions out. If not, please send them to the Wilder School email, and we'll see if we can't get those answered for you. As a reminder, this presentation is being recorded. And we will send out a recap to everyone who registered for this event. And so again, I want to thank our moderator, our speaker. I want to thank those behind the scenes, our communications team, who works very hard to make each event like this be a success. And thank you to Dean Gooden. As a final reminder, we want everyone to RSVP for the upcoming L. Douglas Wilder Symposium, Elections 2024, the importance of listening to the people. This will be a great event. It'll be on September 17th at 5 p.m. You can follow the link in the chat to RSVP. And finally, with the start of the new academic year in August, we will not host a Lunch and Learn in August, but save the date for September 18th for our next presentation. I look forward to seeing all of you then. Thank you for joining us today and sharing your lunch hour. Have a great one.
Thank you all.